Right, good morning everyone, and welcome to this breakfast event joint hosted by Weston Williamson and WSP. A couple of things in terms of safety first, which is a nice positive policy of WSP's anyway. So there are no planned evacuations or alarms, so if you hear something, we will need to evacuate. The closest exit is just outside this door to the left, or outside that door, probably opposite. And there are other exits through the toilets if you're there, by any chance, or through the lift area, and then down the stairs. So I'm not going to say too much, just briefly introduce myself. So I'm Richard Thomas. I'm a transport planner and highways engineer with WSP. And 28 years ago, I worked on the station refurbishment at Cannock on the Chase line when it was first reopened and refurbished. It's now planned to be electrified, which is quite exciting, and has been key to a recent planning permission for a Mill Green designer outlet village. So that's something I've been involved with over a long time, really, as an older guy. In terms of our distinguished guests, we've got Christian Bocci, who's a senior partner at Weston Williamson, Sandeep Shingadia, who's the programme director for Transport for West Midlands here in Birmingham, and Ian Liddell, who's the managing director for our business unit planning advisory in the UK. So let them speak as much as possible. And I'll introduce the presentation now for Christian, please. Thank you.
Good morning. Thanks, ladies and gentlemen. Really great to see you on this early morning. I'll rattle through these slides because I've got lots, I'm afraid, lots of pictures, but I will keep a pace and run through them. We've got lots of expertise and experience of working in transit-orientated or transport-orientated development, so this shows a range of our projects as well as the kind of approach we take to this unusual, slightly unusual sort of area of work. So I'm going to run through the why, the what and how, and then really just around a sort of a high-level TOD proposal that we put forward, and show some of the ways that we approach this kind of project and what we believe good is. So why? I'm not going to run through all of these, but some of them really, there is an environmental case at the core of it, really, particularly about transport movement off-road onto rail, and that's one of the key kind of core things. We have increasing pressure on cities, which includes the use of brownfield sites, many of which are around station nodes. So again, this is a key area that TOD starts to look at. Increasing density in certain areas around those cities, and then really that kind of a sort of a health view of walking and actually rather than car use. And actually that's one of the key things that actually I think will emerge and come about in the future as we look at TOD. But really, I guess the final thing really is just about a funding model that looks to complementarily look at development that links to transport and how the two can work side by side and positively with each other. So I'll just start from the Paris Treaty. This really looks to not increase our global warmings by more than 2 degrees by 2031. And really this is something that we need to start addressing now. And TOD plays not a great part, but a small part in how that might help. We know the issues that cities have associated with car use, increased congestion, increased use. So increasing our move from that mode and a mode shift towards rail is happening. It's increasing all the time. It's something that's just going to get more and more as we're going to move into the future. But it's not so long ago, this is Milton Keynes, that we were planning cities around the car use. This is sort of within my generation time, really. So it's been a short period of time, particularly across countries like America and many of the emerging nations, that we still design very much around the car. A lot of the more recent sort of consultation and works that we've been doing around a whole number of different areas look towards high-density nodes and points around those transport things. And there's a slightly different model that's emerging about how we actually address these things. So what is a TOD? TOD it's an American term. It comes from transit-orientated development. We often interpret that as transport-orientated development because transit's less known as a sort of term. The histories go back to the Metropolitan line, really, as one of the first big TOD schemes, which looks at the whole line of an underground line, which links then to the greenfield development and all the housing that was associated with it, and that part paid for the infrastructure. And this is really almost the first underground line of the world, And this actually was effectively a TOD model. We also have other ones. The classic one is around a hotel linked to a terminus station development. There's many of these around as well, and that's effectively a sort of an old TOD model as well, really, about how you make those complementary uses work together and part pay for each other. So the key issue around, and the definition of it came from the urban sprawl that occurs particularly around America, where the outer suburbs just spread on. There aren't transport corridors that are created to allow that kind of movement in and out of cities, and that car use, which is just fairly blanket use across large areas, creates these issues of movement and placemaking as well, really, effectively. This shows the metric tons per capita of some key places around the world, and interesting to see, again citing USA, and that high use comes from effectively that car use. That's what gives it that spike. UK was slightly better, but even around different areas, you can see how those vary depending on that level of car use for the CO2 use per person. City air, I mentioned earlier, pollution and inner city is increasingly something that's coming to the fore. We see it with the good growth and with pollution issues happening. And TOD plays a part in actually trying to reduce that car emissions use in cities. So again, that's another aspect that comes through with it. But cities are growing. Cities are ever increasingly being the focus point for both work as well as living, as well as leisure. The whole myriad of tasks occurs very much within those cities, and that's a growing trend globally. So our first involvement really on the larger scale infrastructure works is around Jubilee Line extension, and a really interesting project. Just to sort of touch briefly on the sort of the development sort of uplift associated with the sort of core cost of the actual infrastructure. Had a very low business case actually index. It's really low as BCI. But I think the key thing here is that the core costs for paying for that are all central government paid 100%, and the value capture and the issues about the regeneration and the wider areas aren't captured at all. Those are effectively out there, and they don't contribute directly at all to that core transport spend. If we then move to the overground, which we did line-wide work and work at a number of stations, where we do have some interesting developments that actually link transport to development. A lower sort of central overlying cost, slightly better BCI business case, but again no capture effectively from one to the other. It is broadly 100% paid central government project, and there's not an aligning between the value and the there's not a contribution from the value back to the sort of core spend. Coming to Crossrail, this is the sort of wider plan for Woolwich, which is an interesting part of that. That's the extended part of actually the core central line for the hybrid bill. And this is a really interesting case because we have 400 units set with an OSD and adjacent to the existing station. Strong placemaking agenda around and heritage which brought forward. And this is developed out by Berkeley Homes. This is actually paying for the infrastructure. There's a direct correlation between that spend and then the development uplift. So out of Crossrail, this will be really this is a really interesting example of TOD, which actually can be delivered, is demonstrated to be able to be delivered, and actually to have this complementary model with an uplift development associated. So Crossrail, a much bigger project. We have a more complex and a more interesting sort of funding model associated with it. We do have developments part paying for it. They're actually quite low. They're not actually that high, but there is also value capture across the model, which isn't tapped into, and that's known about when we look at things like Crossrail 2 moving forward. I'm not going to run through that. That's a highly complex funding model diagram, but I think the interesting thing just to note really is we have some things in here like Woolwich Station, like these sort of areas where it's not effectively 100% DFT core project. There's a change, there's a move from this away to look at different funding models and different ways of looking at this kind of infrastructure. And if we can actually crack it and get it right, we will be able to actually do more infrastructure because the payments will come from private sector, and there will be wider value capture that actually will allow more projects to happen. But Crossrail, I believe, will be a fantastic project. It will leave a really good legacy. There will be many new places that have life breathed into them again, particularly around places, the placemaking agenda around these key nodes. And I think that moving forward, there will be many interesting and good success stories out of it. On to High Speed 2. There is TOD potential across all of the stations across High Speed 2. There's DFT figures in there asking you to look at the potential for OSD at all stations. That's being requested to be considered, whether there's a good financial case or not, but that is being asked to be looked at. We did work on Old Oak Common here, and in 2012, the aligned jobs and homes to the project as it started was around 14,000 jobs and 1,500 homes. Move forward to 2014, and effectively now, that target has risen massively. It goes up to 90,000 and 19,000 homes. And the relationship between the project works and the development associated around it needs to be looked at very carefully about not missing the opportunities that we have at each of these projects. That's effectively the red line that we have for the High Speed 2 works. But what we're trying to do is to enable both development in and around the station, but also to ensure that the phasing of it can come forward in different ways, in different orders, and still work for the core infrastructure works we're looking at. It's built around a placemaking agenda, the Green Cross, that was developed with the local authorities about this north-south, east-west, strong urban connector that focuses on that station point. So it is very much about linking urban design principles into it. How we deal with the levels, we have a box station that runs through. This is the kind of the connection from left to right. This is your north-south axis, effectively, and how we're actually able to move through the station and make sure that we can actually plan for that onward travel. A bit like Birmingham Central, actually, has done very successfully here. And we're looking at very much this idea of development in and on and around that station. So we have a placemaking iconic building that actually can work as the centrepiece of the station and the wider development. We're looking at the principle here of a linear park running east to west, which is your east-west connector for that Green Cross, and then connectivity through and above the city, above the station, running to the north and south. So that's that kind of proposal with this long, strong linear route that connects through, passes through the station, and also has development in the centre of it. And this will be a really enlivening environment. It will be an environment that isn't just for station travel, but can start to try to create a place and create a sort of dynamic hub for the centre of that piece of work. We did work for Birmingham, for Centro, as it was at the time, Birmingham City Council, which looked at the Curzon Street plan as well, which I know Sandeep will talk in more detail next. And we looked at trying to increase the development potential for that scheme, but also make sure that the connectivity of that piece of work isn't lost in the wider surrounding city. So we pulled the station back. We tried to create more of a square outside the front, a better connection between rail to Moore Street, and an opening up of the area into Digbeth and the wider surrounding. And we put forward a 14-point plan that actually then tried to deal with the key issues for undertaking and assurances going forward, which we hope will manifest themselves into an improved scheme, I think, from the perspective of Birmingham. Crossrail 2, very interesting project. The lessons learnt from Crossrail 1 are already being applied. The central section, the underground section, is now being connected to the wider surrounding north and south, what's called the on-network works, and those are being pulled together, and we're looking at the master planning for the outer areas, as well as the connection points within the centre of the scheme. I'm just going to touch on Kingston, which is an interesting area, particularly around TOD, because it's a huge suburban area, and it's a huge challenge as to how we make that brief join up between the station and the wider regeneration. Very good connectivity from the different stations. There's 9 stations within one local borough, but the background housing is all pretty much low-level suburban. And a site really, this is a project at DLR. This is a station, just a standalone station. There's nothing about master plan development connectivity in the brief at all. It's a nice project, but this is not so long ago. There's nothing in there about actually connecting regeneration to it. And this is some of the sort of developments that are starting to go up in Kingston around different areas of the borough. And there's no connection between this and the station either. And there can be. There's nothing to stop the connectivity of the financial model and the way that the two briefs can work together in parallel and next to each other. So how do we do better TOD? Well, setting a target. So we use ITDP TOD standard. And I think this is really important to maximise that kind of qualitative evaluation of what it is we're trying to do, using integrated briefs that align both development and transport, finding the land opportunity, looking at land parcelling, looking at the wider land portfolio, not just directly around it, but in the wider sense. And delivery, trying to get a single point of delivery, because then the ownership is to a single point, and they will ensure that that project comes forward as one piece and not a disjointed number of pieces. And the governance, really, a clarity of governance of land parcelling, and who owns what, and who has skin in the game, I think is really important to understand very early. So this is from the GLA. This is the demand model, effectively, that we think about cities generally, where we just increase the works in the centre. But there's another model, which is that TOD model, which is actually infrastructure corridors and key hotspots along those, which also have development that feeds into that centre. And we believe this right-hand model is it right? Yes, right. It is the right sort of model and the way to go. So the way we would apply this, looking at projects, is to say this is the current existing infrastructure in red here to the top here. Build a structure around the heritage and the land parcelling. Look at how we can actually, what we can bring forward and how we can actually pull these things together. Make sure that the good parts are left, which actually keeps the character of the area. Then look to a wider urban connectivity of open spaces. Make sure that it actually integrates this area within the surrounding. Then look at station works. Then look at what the infrastructure needs to do. And then look at the development potential that can occur around that sort of structure. And that's a real example. And there are many of these around. You probably all know one or two. So these projects are out there. They just need doing the right way to bring forward that sort of TOD principle. And it's a scalable thing as well. This is the works we did for Crossrail, High Speed 2, but linked to the Crossrail extension package for AP2. And this is just a smaller station at Tring, which is on that sort of route. We look to then say, this is the existing sort of station layout we have. This is how it works. It's a fairly communal garden sort of outer station here with the platforms and how that works. We have a little ticket office that's there. It has its own issues, particularly associated with parking and how that works and links to the actual station, the connectivity between the sides of the station. And in order to, it needs the lifts and access for all type schemes. It needs a safety to do with how you access the station from the car park as well as from the ticket office. And really what we're trying to do is to sort of almost design a station max scheme, something that can work in future, and then look at the development potential that can be unlocked by doing that and linking the two together. And this is a scalable concept. It doesn't have to be just the really big schemes. It can be at all different scales across infrastructure. So just to finalise really, it's about commercially integrating projects, but in parallel linking the community city placemaking agenda with environmental ones as well, so that you have this sort of twinning model between these two. This is the TOD standard that we recommend, and all schemes should aspire to achieving a gold, and I think you can apply those principles. They're very good structural principles to use. And really, just to finish, we conceived of a hypothetical green city project around this for new developments. This has a high-speed centre at the high-speed station at the centre, has a 3-kilometre zero-car walk area, and then it has high-density nodes within it. It has a very strong green urban realm areas within it before you get into the outer area of the city. And I think this is an interesting concept to sort of push to see how you can actually use this model in the wider scale, I think, about the ideas of urban placemaking. So just to finish on a quote here from Jane Jacobs, people make cities, and it is them, not buildings, that we must fit our plans. So it's really about the spaces and places at the core, not just a sort of a financial model that works together. That's it.
Thank you.
Yeah, so thanks, Christian. That was excellent. Just for information, we're planning to take questions towards the end on the agenda and try and get a bit of a discussion going with the three guests at the front. So if you've got anything, please write that down and we'll pick that up. Okay? Sandeep, thank you.
Thank you. Well, good morning, everyone. Great to see so many familiar faces in the audience, so it's always good to talk about something that I'm quite close to and quite passionate about, and particularly speaking in Birmingham, which I'm proud to say is the place that I call home. Born and bred here in Birmingham, even though the accent doesn't give it away sometimes. But Yeah, so great to be here. I'm going to pick up on some of the common themes that Christian's already picked up on. So there might be a bit of overlap, but I think there's some more of the hooks that I want to get into around it. Birmingham's a really interesting place, and there's an awful lot going on at the moment. It's transforming from where it was. Let's face it, you know, a few decades ago, we were still living around the setup of a city which was driven very much by Herbert Manzoni, who was the city engineer at the time, who very much shaped post-war Birmingham. And I think it's fair to say that he liked urban motorways and liked a lot of concrete. Not always great for the sort of things that we're trying to achieve now. There were some interesting comments made around what Birmingham was like, and sort of phrases like a godless concrete urban hell, another brutalist concrete-dominated slave to the motor car. Again, very much driven around how the car was seen as king, and a lot of the transport networks that we had were very much driven around one mode of transport. There was almost this Orwellian-esque view that four wheels are good and anything with two wheels, whether it's wheels or legs, was bad. And some of the remnants of it still can be seen around here, where pedestrians were very much forced to walk under or over the road network, and the motor car had to travel around unimpeded. But thankfully, things have moved on. We definitely see the need for integrated and multimodal transport, and very much how that supports the growth ambitions that we have across the West Midlands, not just in Birmingham, but the other towns and cities that form the wider West Midlands area. And that's where I really wanted to start, a bit on the who, why and what, and recognising that the combined authority is still relatively new. We're about just over 12 months old, so we're just about walking, probably trying to run. But it is a big change from where we've been. Centro doesn't exist anymore. That was all subsumed under the combined authority. But in terms of the combined authority itself, it's 18 local authorities and 4 local enterprise partnerships, and those numbers tend to change. It seems to be growing all the time, but that's the current state of play at the moment. And it really is about moving those powers from Whitehall down to the West Midlands and really using the local knowledge and the understanding of our local areas to define what we want to do with that funding. It's around individual councils still retaining their individual identities. We're not talking about creating a super council here. It is still local councils, but on those big issues that I'll come on to, we'll have the resources and the skills to work together to achieve the right sort of outcomes. The challenges are fairly evident around creating jobs, enhancing skills, developing prosperity, and driving economic growth. And the devolution deal that we've agreed with government will see an £8 billion investment programme over the next 30 years, but that is driven by a fairly healthy grant that comes from government every year to help facilitate some of that growth. The vision is very much around building a healthier, happier, better connected and a more prosperous West Midlands. Just to sort of quickly go through the investment programme itself, it's a big number. Lots of questions around where all the money comes from and how it's all going to work. But you'll see that there's a big part of it that fits around transport, land remediation, housing, and particularly HS2, which I'll come on to a bit later on, because there is a real opportunity around HS2. I suppose I just want to touch on as well what that investment programme is trying to do, and now we've got a mayor in place as well, is very much driving those priorities that we see. And I've touched on some of these before, but these are challenges that most large towns and cities are facing. It's around skills. Do we have the right sort of skills to take forward? How do we address some of the skills gaps that we currently have? How do we provide the right support for businesses if we are talking about getting businesses to invest in our area, which is so fundamental to some of the principles around transport-oriented development? Is what can we do to support businesses? Transport is obviously a key part of it. Housing needs and land restraints. And this really comes back into the view of recognising that we all want the economic growth to happen across the Midlands and the wider area. But there is a big issue around supply of housing and things like that. And about a year ago, we commissioned a dynamic economic impact model for the area. And that really highlights the requirement for housing to come alongside all the other things that are going on. These things need to be balanced. But if you start to constrain housing supply, it will have a huge impact on the growth ambitions that we want to see across the area. And public sector reform, how do we work better as a public sector? How do we start to take away some of that bureaucracy and make it leaner to actually get things done? Just on the transport side, Transport for West Midlands is the transport arm of the West Midlands Combined Authority, and what TfWM are actively doing is prioritising the right sort of investment and the right sort of programmes that will support those wider aspirations for economic growth and other things across the Midlands. We've already developed a strategic transport plan, Movement for Growth, which was adopted by the Combined Authority as their strategic transport plan. And aligned to that, we're currently working on our 10-year delivery plan, which we've just finished consulting on. And that really starts to sort of phase the delivery of various infrastructure programs that we need to see happening across the West Midlands area. And a big part of that fundamentally comes back down to HS2 and how that's a real driver for some of that transport connectivity across the piece. Before I get into that, I just wanted to touch on a few things around where's the opportunity here, and Christian's already picked up on some of this. But I think it's useful context in terms of what I'm going to talk about in terms of HS2 and some of the opportunities around that. Really three key elements that I wanted to touch on around node, place and value, and the market value that really comes from it. Now, in terms of nodes, we've already seen from the previous presentation, these don't necessarily have to be these huge intermodal hubs with lots of lines and different modes coming to them. But there is a hierarchy. You've got those which are largely in our central areas. You can have slightly smaller hubs, which are 2 or 3 public transport lines or modes coming together. And then you can even get down to just single hubs on a network, single stations. So, you know, there's a great breadth of opportunity there. In terms of the place, this is really important, particularly when we look at what Birmingham looked like, you know, even 20 years ago. It's around the value that we can derive from the urban fabric and thinking about things like human scale, permeability, diversity, and the capacity to evolve and be agile in terms of how do we respond to the growing needs of a city or a town. And then there's the market value piece, and that's very much around the key drivers of demand and supply. And thinking about the considerations for demand, for development, the attractiveness, and the specific place for developers and businesses, particularly future growth. And that's really important when we look at those sort of aspirations around demand and what is it going to be in the future. And we've started to do a lot of work thinking what's going to happen in 10 years. How do we actually factor in all this development in terms of housing, population growth that's going to happen? How do we build on that opportunity? On the supply side, it depends on available land opportunities, as we've already touched on, ease in which land can be redeveloped, and the volume of development that will be permitted. And here, this is where the master plans really play a key part. Having clear master plans for areas which show a clear vision to determine how we want that place to actually look and feel. And I'll get onto some of the HS2 examples later on, but the work we're doing at the moment around Snow Hill, there's a number of people sat in the audience who've been working on that over a number of years. What do we do with something like Snow Hill now, and what's the wider master plan for the area? What do we do with Digbeth? You know, having the huge opportunity being right alongside HS2 and Curzon Street, how do we actually plan for those areas and make sure we're doing that in the right sort of way? And fundamentally to that is the early engagement of a whole host of partners, which from a public sector point of view hasn't generally been the way that it's worked. So it's having to evolve in the way that it sees itself doing its business. So we've already touched on Curzon. I wanted to go through it in a bit more detail. In terms of HS2 and the first phase of the line coming into the Midlands, we will see 2 new stations. Curzon Street will be at the heart of Birmingham, and ultimately it will put the West Midlands at the heart of the high-speed network when we get the future phases delivered in due course. HS2 is a catalyst, and you know we talked about red lines earlier in the previous presentation, and that's exactly the thing that we've got to get away from. This is much more than building just a railway. There is a massive opportunity here, and in terms of some of the work we're doing along with the City Council and the partners for Curzon, it really is how do we maximise the opportunity to really deliver some demonstrable benefits over and above the benefits that will come from having HS2 here in the Midlands. Now, as part of the overall HS2 growth strategy, the master plan for Curzon Street was developed launched in 2014, and it sets out her fully integrated city centre station alongside a package of wider interventions can unlock 140 hectares of underutilised city centre land. Now, as part of that and the work that's been ongoing and probably building on some of the work that Weston Williamson have done already, is really focusing on the 5 big moves that we'd like to see happen around Curzon. Sorry, it's not come out very clearly on the slide, but I'll take you through them. The first is creating a world-class destination, and this is really about placemaking around the opportunity of Curzon Street. There's Paternoster Place, and the rest of these really come into how do we integrate this station into the rest of the urban fabric of the city and make sure that we're thinking about connectivity, how people move, and how does it actually work for the central core. So Paternoster Place, there's the metro extension to Digbeth, and again, building on the transport connectivity and thinking about how transport can act as a catalyst, not only for linking into HS2 and the opportunity around there, but also the wider regeneration we want to see heading out towards Digbeth and into East Birmingham, into North Solihull ultimately. The Station Square and Moore Street, and very much thinking about the public realm and how people move in and around the stations and into the other transport hubs in the area. And then Curzon Promenade and Curzon Square. So the master plan itself will maximise potential through the expansion of the central business district with over 400,000 square metres of much-needed Grade A office space, provision of premises to grow creative, digital arts, ICT and sectors in Digbeth and Eastside, creation of exemplar sustainable residential neighbourhoods with over 3,000 homes, and maximising the role of the learning quarter and creating attractive environments for students, researchers and businesses. Allied to that, and I've already said we're going to get 2 stations, so aren't we lucky? There is the work that's been going on around UK Central, and this will be yet another huge opportunity in terms of maximising the benefits of HS2 to the area. So in terms of UK Central, the Urban Growth Company that's been set up published the Growth and Infrastructure Plan just a couple of months ago now. And it really sets out the scale of the potential for the growth period up to 2032, and this is having this longer term vision about where we can go with this. The plan will be underpinned with an evidence base and a hub framework document that provides demonstrable basis for investment by a range of authorities and private investors, which is a key part of the financing that will come from this in terms of if we're going to try and build on land value capture and everything else. It's how do we make an investable proposition here. And again, touching on the point around early engagement with a whole host of partners and stakeholders, the plan is very much bringing together the wider aspirational growth in the area, particularly with companies like Jaguar Land Rover, the National Exhibition Centre, Arden Cross and the airport itself. They've all got huge aspirations for growth in that location, so how do you coordinate effectively to make sure this comes across as a single whole? In terms of the principles that UKC and the Urban Growth Company are using, some fairly common themes here. It is about infrastructure and connectivity. How does that sort of link in with complementary land uses? And in turn, how does that support the creation of high quality environments? And very much thinking about the green element within that as well in terms of the landscape, public environment that we're trying to create. And ultimately, this comes back to, if we get that right, and I'm sure the work that all the partners are doing will lead to that conclusion, this is about releasing and realising the potential of up to a £4.1 billion GVA uplift per annum, nearly 80,000 full-time new roles and jobs, up to 4,000 new homes, and 750,000 square metres of total floor area. So some real ambitious plans there. But it doesn't always have to be about huge scale. And the other sort of angle I wanted to come at here is those examples have been about big stations, big transport hubs, and I want to sort of focus now on what we can do on the smaller scale and thinking about individual stations along corridors or lines that we currently have. And across the West Midlands we have an expansive suburban rail network, and one that is probably creaking at the seams a bit now because the growth has been huge in the last even 8 years. The numbers have doubled. So we've gone from something like 17 or 18 million passenger journeys a year on our suburban rail network to over 50 million in about 8 years. So it just goes to show the sort of value of these rail networks and getting people into the urban centres. What we're doing as part of the Stations Alliance, and this has really been driven by West Midlands Rail, but working very closely with the train operating companies and Network Rail. This is about taking a longer term view and thinking about the wider strategic objectives and some of the commercial opportunities that sit around our rail network. So it's still work in progress, but where we're going with that at the moment is developing master plans along rail corridors, and we're actually doing some work at the moment on the Chase line and the Stour lines to look at what can be achieved. And it isn't a shameless plug, I didn't get paid for it, but Weston Williamson are doing the initial work on that for us. So again, we're trying to build those principles into what can be achieved at a smaller scale. Ultimately, it's about turning what are, at the moment, fairly inward-facing access points to a transport network into community assets that can facilitate growth and development around the communities that they serve. And the vision that's been set out for the Station Alliance is as follows. We will develop stations as a quality gateways between communities and the railway, supporting the changing needs of our passengers, residents and visitors. Stations in the West Midlands will become community assets supporting the well-being and development of the areas that they serve. So it's a bit of a watch this space, but this is very much an interesting angle that we're looking to pursue at the moment alongside our industry partners. And just to sort of finish off on that, and ultimately, this comes down to creating communities. You know, we talk about transport, we talk about the growth and development. This is about placemaking and creating communities. And I've just picked out 4 sort of key things that I think we are working towards. There's the living, and that's very much to create and preserve communities that provide affordable housing, integrated transport systems, and quality education. On the working, it's to enhance regional economic prosperity through jobs, training, and access to education in a way that is designed to retain and attract new businesses. On the moving, it's to promote increasing and improving movement around the region using public transport, electric mobility, walking and cycling to achieve better physical well-being. And on the thriving, it's to support communities that provide access to healthy foods, arts, recreation, entertainment that makes people happy and feel meaningful through active civic engagement. Which ultimately brings me back to where I started in the vision for the combined authority around building a healthier, happier, better connected and prosperous West Midlands. Thank you very much.
So yeah, thanks very much, Sandeep. That was really excellent. So Ian Liddell, if you want to come forward, please. Thanks.
Thanks, Richard. How are we doing for time?
On time, actually. A couple of minutes over, maybe.
Okay, so am I going the right way? Yes. Good. Well, my title is Finding Quick Wins, because this is about how we can find, and quick is a relative term, of course. How can we find opportunities for delivery in the shorter term? This theme is about looking at some of our existing infrastructure and how we can adapt that through creative master planning and some clever engineering to deliver development in a shorter time scale. And I've got a number of examples. One from Birmingham, 3 from London. Don't let the London ones put you off. They're simply in here because the projects where I've been personally involved, and I can speak to you from first-hand experience about these. In terms of London and how it's doing in terms of delivery, it's a graph of overall housing starts. You're getting up towards 25,000 a year, which sounds good, but actually the demand is 50,000 per year. Figures released last week from ONS showed that London's population grew by 100,000 people last year, and the housing delivery is falling well short of that level of demand. That's a problem. The reasons behind that shortfall are fairly complicated, but one element is that I think a lot of the supply is dependent on big infrastructure. So this is a diagram from one of the planning documents, and it's showing a number of nodes with the numbers of homes and jobs which are forecast to be released there. And they're connected by existing and future transport links. But the dependency of development on some of these new transport links means that the development delivery takes on the risk of the infrastructure delivery. The risk of delays, decision making, land acquisition, funding, and so on. And I think this contributes to the shortfall in delivery. There's a scheme which runs right through this, connects a number of the important nodes together. It's Thameslink. I remember when that project used to be called Thameslink 2000. It speaks for itself in terms of the delays. Here we've got Crossrail 2, which Christian mentioned, really important scheme, but the timescale's already slipped and there's still a bit of uncertainty about the funding of Crossrail 2. And I could go on, but suffice to say, I think there's a real need to look at how we can be creative with some of the existing infrastructure. So to move on to some examples, this is a project I started working on in March 2007. And some of this has already been built out now. You might recognise the footprint of the Earls Court Concert and Exhibition Centre. It was an Olympic venue. That's now been completely demolished as part of the enabling works. So this was owned by our clients, Castle and Counties. We then have some Transport for London land, which is a mixture of live railway lines across the site and some maintenance depots. And then there are some Hammersmith and Fulham housing estates on the other side. 3 landowners inside the red line. Ironically, it's the transport infrastructure that takes away the connectivity from this area. There's no east-west connectivity or permeability, and it means that the site is fragmented. So despite the fact that ostensibly there are some very good transport connections here, with the Piccadilly line in blue and Earls Court Station, 2 branches of the District line and their stations, the West London line going through the site. These actually serve to split up the site. So people living in this area really don't have the opportunity to access Earls Court Station. So in terms of working with the team on the master planning, one of the big moves was to look at decking over the line to create that east-west connectivity and to bring the site together. We also looked at adapting each of the 3 stations on the periphery of the site to see how they could be improved and how we could increase the capacity of those stations and improve the connections between all parts of the site and those stations. So that meant that actually there was quite a big development opportunity which could be brought forward by adapting the infrastructure which is already there. This is an image of the consented master plan. So some of this has now been completed. The rest of the master plan, but this adds up to about 10 million square feet of development, so it's 7,500 homes. So quite a lot that can be delivered by adapting what was already there. We're currently working with the team on a further master plan which would add 40% onto the development area in the site. And the West London line, which severs the sites, now runs under this linear park which sits on the deck, because the deck hasn't been put forward as something to build on top of. It's there in order to facilitate connections and to provide attractive public realm. The next example is something which we really started on in earnest in 2014. This has come together fairly quickly. You might recognise this from the opening credits of EastEnders. It's got quite a long history with the Millennium Dome at the end of Greenwich Peninsula. And you might be able to see that we've also got transport infrastructure, some major highways which in fact separate the sites between the east and the west. There are good public transport connections in terms of the Jubilee. Christian mentioned the Jubilee line extension. This is part of it coming to North Greenwich Station, and there's an existing bus station which wraps around this. We've got a cable car built just before the Olympics, not very heavily used. River bus services in blue, which are becoming more heavily used, and quite a lot of bus services which come from the bus station it's effectively a cul-de-sac as far as the bus network is concerned. But the issue, so the transport infrastructure is already there. But in terms of bringing this forward, we need to deal with the severance caused by the road infrastructure, and ironically the bus station, because the bus station, when we looked at it with the team, we found it was in the way and was contributing to a lack of connectivity across the area. So when this was acquired by our clients, Night Dragon, things really started to move quite quickly. We looked at how the severance could be dealt with by a combination of bridging and decking over the roads. Designed a new bus station to move that out of the way so it would better relate to the developments rather than simply relating to the tube station. And we looked at how we could improve facilities for the river bus services, and start to establish a framework for development. So this 3 years later now has a planning consent, and this elements of this are now being delivered. It's 15,000 homes altogether. So a lot of housing delivery, plus other uses, employment, social infrastructure, but achieved by adapting the infrastructure which is already there. We've then got the example of the Kidbrooke Estate in southeast London. There was a very run-down estate, really poor. It had become a really poor environment for the people who lived there. Lots of deprivation in the area and poor quality housing stock. So this at its time was the largest estate regeneration project in Europe. It's a 4,500 units redevelopment. There's an existing railway station which was also a poor quality station in its own right. There were some bus facilities on the north, but not very well connected to the surrounding area, and which also needed investment. And I was the transport witness at the compulsory purchase order inquiry for this in 2010. And one of the biggest issues, which you won't see in an aerial view, is the level differences across the site, and the way that the site had been designed, with a number of steps and elevated walkways, and it really meant that it wasn't well connected, permeable, or an attractive walking environment. So a lot of the proposals here have involved extensively regrading the site to make it accessible, and to link the area into the station, which is being upgraded, and to improve the bus interchange. So this is a CGI. Actually, a lot of this has now been built out. So delivery has happened in a relatively quick timescale, and again, all of this has been achieved by adapting the infrastructure which is already there through a combination of imaginative master planning and looking at the what we could do in terms of the hard engineering and how things could be re-engineered to make development possible. I'm going to join the hat trick of presenters who have mentioned Snow Hill, because Richard and my colleague Karen Evans put this forward as an example of something which has got similar themes to the ones that I have been talking about. You're looking at how we adapt things which are already there, and then better connects them into the surrounding area. So a couple of couple of screenshots from the published master plan for Snow Hill. I know things are evolving in the area, but the principles of an existing station, looking at the future opportunity of adapting that to accommodate the metro, having a better established network of connections in the area, and crossings of the roads which otherwise take away the connectivity and permeability of the area, and looking at strategic connections between this area and its station, and existing stations in the case of new streets, and looking to the future with Curzon Station. And the published master plan version of development, which can be brought forward, which is highlighted here in the purple colours. So a number of examples along that theme about how we can reduce some dependency on the delivery of brand new major infrastructure, and see how we can achieve the most by adapting what we already have in the shorter term. Thank you.
So if I could ask the three speakers to bring a chair forward, if that's okay, and get comfortable. So I'll open to questions in a second. If you could introduce yourself, that would be nice as well, just so we can keep it in terms of communication. Perhaps one question from me while people are forming their exciting ones. There was a mention, Sandeep, about consultation on your plans, and then all three of you talked about developers and stakeholders. As someone who's passionate about transport and that kind of thing and economic growth, I can see all this is really exciting. How close do you think the general public, stakeholders, and perhaps less forward-thinking authorities are to catching up with what's going on, and the same for developers really as well? I don't know who wants to start.
But it's a really good question actually, because one of the areas that we still struggle with a lot as a profession, I think, when coming at it from a transport profession, is thinking about the end users and thinking about the customer. How do we actually articulate the benefits of the transport, probably medium to long term, but you've got a huge population out there who's worried about how am I travelling in the next few days, or what's going to happen in the next year. So how do we articulate those messages in the right way? And I think we're still evolving our approach around how do we actually get meaningful consultation with the public around some of the things that we want to do. In terms of working with developers and wider stakeholders, I think that's definitely a space that we're moving into now, around how do we get some of this early engagement going on, and how do you actually start to form some better collaborative working or alliancing, or whatever phrase you want to use. But it is about some of that early engagement. How do people start to buy in to the sort of ambition and vision that you want to deliver? And use that to help shape that ambition and vision as well, because there's certain things that we often get caught up in technical details, whether it's a transport scheme or anything else, is really fundamentally understanding the deliverability, the commerciality of what it is we're trying to deliver, but also then how do we bring in more innovative ways in terms of financing and funding these sorts of transport schemes or wider. We're definitely moving away from there's big pots of money with certain labels on for transport schemes or anything else at central government anymore. We've got to think far more collaboratively and innovatively about how we access that. And a lot of that will come through better engagement with our stakeholders and partners.
I think that's really important, particularly with local communities, to explain things in a way where they can really understand the difference it's going to make to them and their families, the difference it will make on the ground. I think we've been guilty in the past of using a lot of jargon, technical jargon, economic jargon, talking about agglomeration benefits and things which I've struggled to understand some of it, and we really do need to make sure that people can see the benefits of development in terms of improving their local areas and the buildings to live in.
Anything to add?
I just see it as an issue of ownership, particularly with transport hubs. We all own them, really. We all have a stake in them. And I think consequently, it therefore becomes about the consultation and actually being really forward-thinking and open. And I'm asking the questions of everybody, what do you want it to do? What do you want it to really be? And it can be from crash drop-off points at coastal station hubs through to small-scale retail, through to community garden assets, through to development, through many, many things that we can actually align to the core transport hub use, which I think you put out with a lot of your key themes, I think, as well. And I think it's just really important to think of them in a different way, and I think to be bold about asking the questions. And as we go into this kind of current, much more open consultation kind of mode, I think it's really exciting and refreshing. We should be open to it rather than closed in more traditional ways of thinking.
Thanks. All right, so any questions from the floor? Yes, go ahead.
Paul Rice from Savills. If I could just ask a supplementary, I think, to the Chair's question there, really. Perhaps to Sandy. Sort of reluctant authorities or words to that effect in part of that, and thinking about combined authority here. The strategic economic plan from the combined authority being a combination of the three LEPs and seeking a higher level of economic growth than the combination of the three LEP SEPs. And we've got a once-in-a-generation opportunity to do it based upon the transport infrastructure spend, which is coming, and the unique changes that will bring. There are very obviously some local authorities that are dragging their heels in that within the combined authority, and they're not planning for anything like the right level of economic growth, physical development, for which there is this blinding opportunity. How are you dealing with that, and what confidence can you build on resolving that?
Two key things here. I think in terms of the combined authority, it's still relatively new, but there is definitely a willingness to work together, and that was the whole premise of trying to pull it together. Now, there's always been this notion of balance, and how does everyone get something in a much broader area? That's why they've all got to steam the game. They think they're going to get something out of it. Now, the principle has always been agreed that not everyone will benefit in the same way at the same time, but there will be an overall benefit for the whole area. Now, we have this distinction between who are the constituent authorities of the combined authority at the moment, which are the 7 metropolitan areas, and we've got a number of non-constituents or observer status areas that sit outside. So, in terms of the actual decision-making, really only sort of focuses, or the power only really sits with the constituent authorities. The added dynamic recently has been the addition of the Mayor, and the Mayor can really start to cut across some of these issues, where we are talking about lifting this to a bit more of a strategic level discussion around. This isn't about individual local authorities or even sub-regions. One would argue that there's been a tension between the Black Country and Birmingham and Solihull for a number of years. But how do we start to overcome that in terms of recognising that nearly 60% of people, when they're travelling to work across district boundaries, they don't really care about whether it's one local authority or another. What they're worried about is the infrastructure that supports their daily lives. So how do we start to elevate those discussions? Now, some of the mechanisms around that are what we've introduced recently are things like the Key Route Network, which is for the first time we have a classification of our road network, which is outside the local authority boundaries. So it is about 7% of our entire road network, but it carries about half of all the traffic flows with public transport, freight, highways, and whatever else. But that starts to bring a level of coordination to a central point to say this is what this network needs to achieve. That you all need to buy into that. This isn't about Sandwell or Dudley or anyone else saying, actually, we want our road network to do this. The control is sort of being lifted to that more strategic level, and the Mayor actually has some powers over that key network. So it's those sort of mechanisms, but I suppose all of this becomes futile if we can't start to show some early benefits and deliverability around what difference is this way of working actually getting us to. So obviously the Mayor has only got a 3-year term initially, so there's a big push on what can we actually achieve, what tangible things can we achieve in those first 3 years that can really start to sell the benefits of this is why this is a great idea and this is why we need to work at a much more joined up way. I mean, there's still, I think there will always be, a lot of it comes down to local politics around the reluctance of certain local authorities to sort of play an active part in it. I think that tide is starting to turn where there is a view that others may get left behind if they don't start working towards that wider vision that we're trying to achieve.
So can I ask something? Sorry. Do you see the Mayor actually physically forcing authorities to play ball then, or is it just coercion?
I think it's, at the moment, it's a coercion. The Mayor has obviously got some very clear priorities. He chairs the CA board now in terms of the government, so he sits there and has fairly good visibility of what's going on. He's got some very clear priorities, which are very much aligned to the strategic economic plan priorities. I think there is a view of, let's see where we can take this, but I think the Mayor will be able to exert some power and control over what needs to be achieved. Ultimately, having the Mayor might be a get-out for some of those local political issues. It might be a way to sort of overcome that, saying, well, actually, this is being driven from somewhere else. It's not actually us making those decisions. So it'll be interesting to see how the dynamics play out over the next few months.
Confident?
I think so, yeah.
Thanks, Sandeep. Lawrence, did you go?
Yeah, very much. Lawrence Holmes, GBA. I thought it was quite interesting you touched on HS2 presentation earlier on. I know that there's a massive appetite from investors in that area. I think it's going to be absolutely huge, and the catalytic effect of that. One thing that does strike me though is the difference in levels there. I mean, it's pretty stark, and these things are going to come in at about 30 metres height, above the street level. I just wondered whether there are any ideas amongst the teams as to how that should be addressed, because from my perspective that's a little bit unclear, to really sort of open up that connectivity, ensuring that it's not a barrier, particularly around New Canal Street and New Bartholomew Street. There's some real value to be had. I just really wonder, what thoughts, if any, there are to really improve that sort of interface.
That's a very good question. It's a very complex and difficult site, and particularly if you walk around it and actually look on the ground, you see how challenging it is. I think the key thing to it, there are a few things. One is to ensure that the areas that you're able to deck that make improved connectivity are able to be technically delivered and done. And they will make a big difference to the connectivity in the wider ground, particularly big with, I believe, in the corner to there. I think that the tradition of terminus stations is that everyone kind of comes out the front door and the onward travel is in the direction of the rail. And I think the rear route, the kind of perpendicular route is really important for the trams to come there. But I do think that you need to make sure you don't make a over-complex station which has two entrances, which you don't know which one's the primary and which one's the secondary, and that's really important to ensure. In terms of the levels, we look to continue the station lines further in into four stations into the back to create more of a square. And I think the focus is particularly around each of those areas as well. I mean, the interesting story I talk about is King's Cross has two stations coming in, two terminus stations next to each other, and you have a quality environment within the V, but to the outer sides, terminal stations, as they have blank facades, and they can be very long. You've got 400 metre blank facades, and active frontage is really important. At Curzon Street, you almost have the opposite. We'll have good active frontages to the outer sides of those two things, but internally, that's where the sort of TLC, that's where the care is looking for that core part in the middle, the reverse of King's Cross. So I think it is challenging, but I think that it needs careful consideration in an urban, widest urban realm sense.
Yeah, I mean, just to add to that, there's an awful lot of work going on at the moment, so there's a fairly strong governance around how we actually work effectively with HS2 and other stakeholders and partners, City Council, Transport for West Midlands, in making sure that Curzon is effectively integrated into the space that it's going to occupy. How do you reduce the sediments? And you've got some, it's challenging in terms of the levels, the layout of other railway viaducts, etc., etc. But there are some real opportunities there in thinking about the opportunity for undersite development and wider commercialisation of the station, the linkages into Leeds and making sure those are maintained. And really understanding the use of good design and public realm and the sort of natural design lines away from that station into other parts of it. And even though we agree that one needs a station entrance, it needs a public design, I think understanding the permeability of how is this going to work for people who want to travel around that area. And there's still quite a lot of concern around what happens to people. It can't be just cut off from that because of what happens with Curzon Street. And the Duke Master Plan very much is picking that up in terms of how is that connectivity working and how will it work in the future. Also, it's about feeding into the design panel and making sure that the designs that are coming forward for the station are utilising all of that wider work that's going on alongside it.
Yeah, I think a key area of that will be paternoster.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's, that really is significant. But as you say, it is a constraint, particularly on the size of that station, isn't the length of it, and just trying to sort of maximise permeability.
I suppose the other challenge that comes as part of this is, we've spoken about red light before, it's what HS2 will pay for in terms of their station, and then anything we want over and above that, we've got to fund and find the money for. So it's about making the appropriate business cases and thinking about things like EZ funding and anything else that we can do to make sure we deliver the right solution rather than saying that's what we're going to get as the stock answer to delivery of the station.
I think in general there is a challenge of when you're designing very big infrastructure, to be able to also design it at the human scale. And Dr. Christian's point about walking about the area is a really important one, so that you're thinking about it from the point of view of someone on the ground. The project examples I showed all in a helicopter view of the site, to present an overview. But of course, you can't design from that perspective. It's got to be from a person's perspective. And I think things which help with the design process are 3D modelling and being able to do some visualisations and walkthroughs, and not simply as a presentation tool, because this sometimes happens with the bolt-on extras to be used for consultation, but they can be very useful in terms of as a design tool to understand how to walk through the area and to help with its ways of improving the design.
Thanks, Ian. Any more questions from the floor? Oh, yeah, thank you.
Hi, Spencer Clay from Gallagher Estates.
Hi, Spencer.
Many of the examples we've heard about today are very much from an urban context, and it's quite clear that the principles we're discussing work really well in a city or urban environment. But I suppose I'm interested in how well the principles attach to suburban or urban fringe or even rural context, particularly given the overlap with the housing crisis we've got and the opportunity to align the two investments.
Start with Ian, I think, then. He looks keenest to answer first.
Well, that was a mistake. It's a good point. There are other examples of where infrastructure has been successful in urban fringe and rural situations. I think examples from Cambridge, the guided busway and the difference that has made in terms of connecting new places outside the established urban area is a good example. Other new settlement proposals which involve new stations on existing lines are also relevant. I think the stations alliance, some of that might be relevant here, but I think a lot of the principles are in common in terms of looking at existing railway lines, existing stations, opportunities for new stations, and how they can be better connected into the surrounding area.
Yeah, I would agree. I think the principles of sort of the node, the place, and the value, I think, are applicable. The work that we're doing on the Chase line and the Stour line, sort of, they are going out of the urban core, they're going out into the suburbs. But it is about looking at the opportunities, and I think it's just a question of scale. How do you apply those same principles and think about the scale of the opportunity that you potentially have? We're quite fortunate with a large rail network which goes out way beyond our metropolitan boundaries already. Our journey to work here is quite far and wide. So this goes to show the opportunity for rail to support some of that and developments that then would follow around some of that. I suppose one of the challenges we always get, particularly if we're talking about new stations or new transport infrastructure, is what comes first is the development of transport, and how do we make the case for that in a more coherent way. The bulk of the transport infrastructure that we build operates still through sort of very I'll call it fairly archaic system of DFT, web tag guidance and all the rest of it, does it necessarily allow us to capture the real value of redevelopment and regeneration that we want to see in some of these places, whether they're urban, suburban or even rural? Does the current setup allow us to do that? And I think that's still quite a big challenge. It's starting to evolve, but is it evolving in a way that actually genuinely supports the things that we want to achieve?
I would just add to that, on Crossroad 2, we look to a 1 kilometre, 10-minute walk zone, where that's the sort of area which captures development, value uplift and warehousing and other functions can go within it. Personally, I think that should be taken further to a 3-kilometre cycle zone as well, because I think then really you're talking not just about what happens in the immediate environment of the station, but what developments and what will happen in the wider area, because then it's how that gets fed and how the connectivity to the station gets fed. And many of these outer small suburban stations are parkway stations, they're capped by the parking, and you have, it's nearly always a parking issue in all these stations, where it's full and it starts to burst out onto the roads and all the rest of it. So you either have a modal shift to feed that demand, or you increase the parking capacity without compromising the developments and the connectivity that it has in the wider surrounding. So it's very much rail connectivity first that feeds the wider slingshot developments in those areas, and then you can see what you can then develop on top of that that doesn't compromise it. It's kind of, in my mind, going and prioritising that way. If you do it right, you need to get it right.
Thank you.
I think to bring back to my first question to the panel as well, it'd be great to see every authority that's got a station or stations within its boundary, whether that's urban fringe or rural, having some kind of idea and master plan for what it can do with that station. Just start to think about it so that there's dialogue between development, developers, local authority, rail authority, everyone can start talking because someone's got an idea really. So
I think that's it's really would be really valuable. It was the example of the 10-year view
yeah.
on things, because your politicians with their timescales are working on 3 years. An example of the mayor. Your Network Rail is working on 5-year control periods. The train operating companies are largely working on 7-year franchise periods. So there is a need to take a longer term view, because a lot of the major undertakings by their nature are multi-decade projects.
Any more questions? Got time for a couple more? I know a quarter of the audience, so I might name one of you if no one volunteers. Perhaps we'll wrap up then. I mean, I noted a few key words, and I thought I'd just list those as the speakers have been talking and answering, or keywords and phrases. So the ones I liked and picked up on are visualisations as design tools, active frontage, reducing severance, the human scale, deliverable, and then these three I like: partnership, ownership and coercion. Slightly controversial last one. And then TLC as well, which I think is tender loving care. I don't know if it's a transport term because there's so many new acronyms these days. And it occurred to me, and there was the mayor as well, it occurred to me, apart from the word mayor, those are all words that I think I use all the time when I'm negotiating for developers or with the public to convince them of a scheme. And I think that's where there's perhaps a bit of effort to be put into that. I don't know if any of you speakers have got any final words you want to make before we wrap up. Christian, clear.
I would say look to Scandinavian countries. If you look at the modal shift of the things that's happening there, they're ahead of their game in terms of what will happen here. I believe. If you look at things like that modal shift, you have in many or most stations under 10%. If that, it could be under 5% in most of them, and they're up to 40%. To their modal shift, going to cycle predominantly, walk and cycle. And what that does is it allows for a huge uplift in the actual proportional use that each of those stations can have. And I think what links to that as well then is the passenger experience, that you have more surety, safety, better environment, healthier routes, healthier ways to use these transport hubs. And if you think about it as a passenger experience model, and then build around it as to what that is, and it can include development, it can include retail, it can include other things, because they actually add into that experience model, then you start to then build an idea and a way of thinking about them, which is a qualitative one. And then the quantitative things come from that. They will follow. And they follow in a very strong way, I think. So, but think of it as qualitative. How can we make it as good as possible almost? And look to that model that's happening out there as well.
I think just for me, it's there is it's the scale of the opportunity and it's the scale of the challenge. And it is about the people factor, the fact that the population of this metropolitan area is going to grow about the size of another city being added into it, nearly 500,000 people in the next 15 years, is a big driver into some of the things that we need to address. And that's across some of our large stations and our smaller stations. It's all going to work as an integrated transport network. And it is around the people. What are the people trying to achieve? Transport isn't, well, from our perspective, it's not a means to an end in itself. People are using it to go to work or get skilled, get education, whatever it is. So how do we continue to build on that role that it needs to play to support that wider aspiration across the Midlands?
Very good points, and I think I'd add to that in terms of you're taking a longer term view on development, which is I found quite a liberating experience because it means that there are more things which become possible when you're thinking about the longer term, and to look at international best practice and not to be constrained by the way that we did it the last time. You're particularly bearing in mind that a lot of investment which is coming in is international investment, and we need to be thinking international in terms of looking at best practice for delivery, but something that works in our local context.
Yeah, thank you. Right, so thanks very much everyone for attending, and special thanks to Christian, Sandeep, Ian for speaking. And then behind the scenes organisers, we've got Claire, Samantha, Isabel and Karen, so thank you very much. We've got crunches at the back, and given the public sector audience, other chocolate bars are available. There's also fruit, and there's more coffee and tea outside, and probably more food. So please hang around and ask questions if you've been nervous, and just show appreciation to everyone who's involved. Thank you.